So I got back to Cuba years later, a year or two later, and I saw Guevara, who was then the head of the National Bank. Nice story about how he became the head of the National Bank. The story was told to me by Ernesto and his colleagues. He said that Castro was having a meeting of his de facto cabinet after taking over. And he said, we need someone who knows about economics in this thing to be, and Che raised his hand. And he said, I can. And he said, you said you wanted a comunista? I said, no, economista. So Che got the job. That's the apocryphal story. And he was indeed the economics minister, and I met him. And I referred to that letter from Dolores. He said, it's a very sad thing. The man who was carrying that pouch of letters was killed, and we found the pouch with his body. And I have the letter here. You can give it back to Dolores and tell her that it was delivered finally to me, which I did do when I got back to Washington. And Guevara also was at his pains to paint himself as, how can I put, a third world neutralist leaning leftist. I would say nationalist radical. But he said nothing that you would construe as being an apologetics for the Soviet Union or anything like that. And he later, of course, went to Africa and became involved in Angola.
Those were really the earliest days of the founding of the non-aligned movement, right?
That's right.
And
sure.
Cuba was very much a part of that.
Well, when he came and talked to the Overseas Press Club, among others, one of the persons who heard him was Joe Alsop. And Joe Alsop wrote a column. And he said, I'm very interested. He said, when I hear Castro, he said, it smells of Cairo, not of Moscow. He said, it's the kind of grandiloquent rhetoric that you get of the Nasser types in the newly emerging.
Or Tito.
Yeah, that's right. Tito was then a thing.
Yeah.
So this was a consensual view when Castro took over. And as to whether it would have made any difference if we had treated things differently, that's a subject of an interesting thing. But Ernesto was with him when he made his first American tour. And let me tell you this, he had just taken power, came to Washington. Eisenhower, then president, took great care to be out of town so we would have no reason to meet him. He didn't want to meet him in any way because the American ambassadors in Cuba had been connected with the Batista regime over the years, and the U.S. was in a very compromised position. Indeed, in the famous debate that Jack Kennedy had with Nixon, when at one point Kennedy said in 1960, Mr. Vice President, in years past they used to say in Havana, the second most powerful person in Havana was the U.S. ambassador. They don't say that anymore. And that was meant as a bit of praise for our past relationship with Cuba, because one of Kennedy's friends was the high-swinging ambassador to Havana, a dating friend of his. And Nixon very much on the defensive, tried to blur everything, even as they were preparing the Bay of Pigs operation. So anyway, I went through this trip, I came back, and sequel happens. The sequel is this. Kennedy comes in. And I have to say I played a part with Ernesto in the Kennedy campaign because my close friend was Dick Goodwin, who was then a speechwriter and general adjutant for Kennedy. And he came to me, he said, Karl, Kennedy's got to give a big speech in Miami about Latin America, and we don't know really what to say. We'd like to say something with a hopeful word, maybe like Esperanza or Alianza, And I said, let me ask Betancourt. So I went to Ernesto, and I said, they'd like to do something with a slogan. And he said, well, I make two suggestions. You could have Alianza para Desarrollo, which means development, or Alianza para el Progreso, Alliance for Progress. So I went to see Dick Goodwin, and Dick said, oh, Karl, Kennedy could never pronounce Desarrollo. So we went for Alliance for Progress. And so I claim co-baptismal rights in that.
The Alliance for Progress.
And and when Kennedy came in, we were all hopeful for a change. And the next thing I know is my friend Ernesto Betancourt comes around and said, Carl, there's something mad going on. I said, what is it, Ernesto? He said, your guys, your CIA guys are recruiting an army in Miami, training them in Guatemala to invade Cuba. This was, let's say, February, March 1961. And I said, that sounds incredible. And so I ran into Dick Goodwin on the street. And I said, hey, Dick, I understand you guys are training a secret army to invade Cuba. He said, who told you that? And I said, well, I have my sources. He said, don't you write any of that crap. You know, I deny it completely. And so then I checked out and found that what Ernesto had told me was true. And I first tried to get a story in the Washington Post. And
Well, Scotty Reston found out the same thing, and Kennedy personally asked him not to publish
I'm
it.
coming to that.
Okay.
I'm coming to that. So I brought it up with my editors at the Post, said there's a story here. And they went to Phil. And Phil consulted Kennedy. And Kennedy said, please don't run a line. And this was, let's say, a month before the operation. So I was frustrated and disgusted. I wrote a piece for the New Republic called Our Men in Miami and sent it to Gil Harrison, the then editor of the New Republic. And Gil was a little nervous, so he said, I'd like Arthur to look at this. So he sent it over to Schlesinger at the White House. And Arthur said, Gil, I want to talk to the president. I got to go to the Oval Office on this one. So he showed it to the president, and the president said, Arthur, would you ask Gil as a favor not to run the piece? So then Harrison called me and told me the story, and I said, oh, I'm very disappointed, but what will you do? I can quickly add that every story I've told you is in 1,000 Days by Arthur M. Schlesinger, who had the credit to say that it was one of the decisions he regretted, and he felt that it was a mistake, that Kennedy should have said, let the story run. And the same thing happened with the New York Times. Mm-hmm. Tad Schultz was then the chief Latin American correspondent based in Brazil. And Tad was coming home via Miami. And he talked to the local Times guy who was a Polish emigre. Tad is Polish by birth. And in a minute I can remember the emigre's name. Is really a great character. He was the Times stringer in Miami. He said, Tad, you know the CIA's got a guy named Freddie who's going around recruiting all he can to start. And Tad said, I don't believe it. He then checked it out. It was true. He came back to Washington, and he said, we've got to run a story on this. So it went into the news side through the foreign desk,
Yep.
and Abe was for running it. Scotty Reston checked with the Oval Office and was told the same thing, please don't run it. But what the Times did is they compromised. They ran the story without mentioning CIA. They said a private army is being organized in Miami with no reference to who was doing the organizing. Later, the great footnote was that after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy saw it was either Scotty or one of the Times grandees, maybe even Punch, and said, you know, that was a great mistake. We should have said, you should have run that story. It would have blown the cover on it. The whole idea was crazy.
I think it was Reston he told that to, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Scotty, yeah.
Yep.
Scotty Reston, yeah.
So, I mean, that was the kind of the background of the Bay of Pigs.